Okay, and Crystal, while you share your screen, I will give our attendees a brief introduction for you. So Crystal Kadakia is the CEO of the LCD Group. She is a two-time TEDx speaker, organizational consultant, and best-selling author. She is known for seeing and leveraging the most exciting possibilities for workplace culture in the digital age. One field she specifically contributes to is learning and development via her work on the Owens-Kadakia Learning Cluster Design Model. Crystal has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's in organizational development. And Crystal, you're on the schedule now for the next hour. And so if anybody has questions while you're doing your presentation, you can put them in the question and answer section, or you can put them in the chat. And then toward the end, we'll address them. So Crystal, I will turn over I'll turn over the microphone to you, but I'll turn over the whole thing to you. So you can go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Steve. And feel free to put your reactions in the chat as well. It's great to see both reactions and questions. Appreciate you all being here today. So yeah, Steve did a great job introducing me. I'll dive right into the content. This is something I hear a lot from everyone, from clients we work with, from participants, from my own experience working in L&D. I'm curious how many of you have heard something like this. It was a great training, but it's been a few months. People still aren't using the new skills and knowledge. How do we make training content more than one and done? That's something I often hear. And it's not too surprising. We're still, even after a year of the pandemic, we've moved to a lot of remote learning, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're making an impact back on the job. And that's where our learners and our businesses really want to see a difference. And I think that's where we really hope to have an impact. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today is about a model that a colleague and I, Lisa Owens, developed about 6 years ago now. And we've been teaching this model and sharing it and watching the impact, really studying the impact. And we submitted a paper as a part of this conference, and you can read more about how the model is having an impact in the industry through that journal piece. But the model's goal is really to make training content more than one and done. So you all probably are up on the research just as much as I am, and we often come across white papers that these are from LinkedIn Workplace Learning and Degreed How the Workforce Learns. But we see these types of statistics all of the time. 33% of learners say current training programs are not a productive use of time. 8% of business executives see the business impact of L&D. What was interesting about that figure was that it was somewhere around 85 to 90% of business executives saying that we really need L&D. So they were growing their investment in L&D, but just having a hard time connecting the dots to the business impact. And then interestingly enough, less than 25% of L&D professionals are willing to recommend their own programs, the programs they develop, to peers. So I hope that in your organizations, you see better stats, of course, and even if you don't, I think it would just be great if we were consistently moving the needle higher on what we're delivering for both our learners, our business, and as a part of our own work. So one of the reasons why we see that we're falling short is not actually because we're doing anything really all too wrong or anything bad. It's really just, as we all know, a lot has changed in the last 20 years in our workspace. It's changed for learners, it's changed for our stakeholders. And here are just a couple of the shifts. I mean, the first one, urgent challenge for L&D, remote work. Of course, we're all in the thick of this in the last year and a half, but this whole working from home thing, Apple has a really great commercial on this. It's hard and it's very different when you can't rely on the face-to-face immersive kinds of training that is typically our first go-to as L&D. Diverse learners is another urgent challenge for L&D. We've been historically very much in the space of treating our learners like they're a monolith. And of course, we know human beings are far more complex. And when we think about what's calling for us to think about new models for designing learning, diverse learners is another huge factor. And then in the flow of work, this has become the new catchphrase. Some more research from white papers, 68% of employees prefer to learn at work, 58% learn at their own pace, and 49% prefer to learn at the point of need. So all of that data is just sharing, and we see this all the time, that people are learning everywhere, anytime, in a variety of methods, and a lot of times of their own choosing. So where does L&D evolve in order to meet all of these challenges? Where do we need to evolve? So I love this quote from Albert Einstein. He said, "Learning is an experience. Everything else is just information." And there's no time greater than now where this could be more true. We are in a even more information overloaded world than ever before. Historically, when our L&D models were developed, we were not at a time where information was coming all the time, constant connection. And sure, anyone can Google something, but learning is that experience. And that is what we in L&D are really good at and really need to continue building as we think about our future. So I'd like you all for a moment just to imagine a modern learning journey. Think about the last time you learned something new. Think about this for yourself. The last time you learned something new, how did you close that learning gap for yourself? And while you think of your example, I'll share an example from a few years back for me. I was taking a trip to France, and this was, again, a couple years ago. And I don't know if you all have been in this situation where you're going on a family vacation and you're kind of the linchpin. You're the person everybody is going to rely on in this during this trip. And you know, I knew that, okay, my family, they're going to want me to plan the whole thing. And more than that, I'm going to be the one that needs to learn a little bit of the language. I know that in France, we're going to need to have a little bit of French, especially traveling in some of the smaller areas we were going. So I was like, okay, I need to learn French. What am I going to do? So I did what probably many of you would do. I started out downloading some handy apps and started to use those to learn French. But I quickly realized this is just giving me random words, and this isn't as much of how I learned. What I needed was, you know, remember way back in high school, you take your language classes and it's very structured and you learn about consonants and vowels and basic grammar. So I found this guy on YouTube, Vincent, and he had this great course called Learn French in 5 Days. What he didn't tell you in that title is that each video is about 5 hours long. So I made it through, you know, the first part of the first video, but it really started helping me get the basics. And so YouTube was my next source. Then as I started getting closer to the trip, I started practicing more at home, and that's my husband. And I figured, you know what, he doesn't understand half what I'm saying anyway. So me talking in French to him, not going to make much of a difference, but sure will help me practice. And then I really started getting close to the trip. I mean, we were getting like the 2 weeks before the trip, and I'm like, you know, I just need some old school flashcards. I need to memorize some essential phrases so that way I've got what I need in my back pocket. So this is everything I did before I even took off on the plane. But it's not like my learning stopped there. When I got to France, the learning continued, right? When I walked into bakeries or coffee shops or hotels and I was checking in, I would always listen to the person in front of me and listen to what they're saying and their accent and all the little quirks, and I would be learning in that moment. Of course, I had the person I would talk to interact back with me, and that was a point of learning. And then if I ever ran into trouble, I had Google Translate on my phone, which was amazing. And I also had my handy Rick Steves phrase book. So just think about all of the different ways, times, and places I was learning, both in the moment of need and also in preparation, and compare that to what you or a typical organization offers for employees in their L&D offering set to close a capability gap. What I've seen in organizations is we're still pretty far off from this, and yet this is how everyone is learning today. They're learning through a variety of ways, times, and places, and we're just trying to figure out how to evolve to this point of time. And some of us aren't evolving. Some of us say, well, the classroom is our bailiwick, that strict curricula with the formal start and stop, that's what we're good at, and that's where we're going to stay. And other organizations are in different modes where they're starting to evolve and looking at different ways to develop and design learning. So based on that modern learning journey, this really sparked Lisa Owens and I developing the learning cluster design model. What happened is that about 6 years ago, the Association for Talent Development asked us to design a workshop for modern learners, for L&D about modern learners. ATD thought we were going to be teaching people about millennials, and I do a lot in generational transition, at least at that time. That was a big culture change, of course, going on with the digital age. And so they were like, yeah, can you design a class on modern learners? And I said, okay, sure. Well, what they didn't know was the very first thing we did was really ask, what does it mean to be delivering modern learning? And that's where it became very clear to us that the way in which people learn today is different than what our traditional L&D design models, our instructional design models, were designed for. One of the most fundamental differences we found is that traditionally there's an assumption, and we benchmarked over 40 instructional design models as we were doing this work. And most of them have a basic assumption that our job as L&D is to design one thing, be it a classroom course, an e-learning, a set of videos. It's to design a curriculum and to do that really, really well. And that's great, but as you probably reflected on your modern learning journey, and as I reflected on mine, and I watch people, that's not how we learn today. Whenever we have a capability gap, we don't learn through just one asset, what we call a learning asset. So what's out there to help us strategically design a set of learning assets? And we found that there really wasn't anything. And so that's what the learning cluster design model is about. It's about a new job for L&D. We really looked at the shifts from industrial age to digital age, and we questioned the basic assumptions that are made in our historical instructional design models. And at the same time, we looked at what are we really good at that we want to bring with us into the future. So some of this, as you look at, as you're taking in the image of the model, you might say, well, that doesn't look too different. And that's by design. We know that if a model is going to be so different and so newfangled and such a big leap, no one's ever going to adopt it. The truth is, change management requires that we use the best of our expertise, and now in this new context. So we're certainly leveraging L&D's historic expertise and orienting all of that towards a new job for L&D. And that new job is that whatever we're designing needs to be beyond one and done. It needs to focus on changing on-the-job behavior. It needs to take into account diverse learner contexts, and it needs to design the whole, not just the parts. So that last one, what that's saying is there are organizations that have multiple different learning assets. They've got videos, they've got their social learning community, they've got the class, but they weren't designed most often they weren't designed thinking in consideration of one another. We're really looking at that whole set of assets. How do they work together? How are they focused on these diverse learner contexts? And how do they, because they're not just limited to the classroom or that one program, how do they then change on the job behavior? So our new job for L&D is that L&D, everybody needs, given a capability gap, everyone needs to be designing a set of learning assets, both in and out of the flow of work. And that's what our 5-action model is intended to help L&D do. And so the visual you're seeing there is actually of those 5 actions. And I'll be giving you a bird's eye view of those as well as some examples. So when you do this new deliverable, this set of organized intentional assets, that is what we call a learning cluster. And we can talk names all day. We went back and forth with many names, but this is what we call a learning cluster. And rather than designing a class, course, program, set of videos, a curricula, we believe L&D's new job is to design learning clusters where you want to make an impact back on the job. So it's all about supporting when, where, and how learners need to learn for on-the-job performance. And we divide up our different learning assets into social, formal, and immediate ways. So formal, that's what we are in L&D are most used to designing. It's often for what's called that first moment of learning need. For any of you who are familiar with Mosher and Gottfriedsen's work, the 5 moments of learning need, we in L&D are really often focused on the first time someone's learning something and it's new for them. And we design these formal programs that have a start and a stop. You have to go through in a certain sequence and so on and so forth. What we're less strong at is designing social learning and immediate learning. So immediate learning being learning assets that are available 24/7 all of the time, and social assets being social learning. And whenever you're learning with, through people. And so you can see how I organized my French learning journey through our learning cluster template. This is our quintessential Venn diagram for a learning cluster. So essentially, if I'm boiling down the difference, if you approach learning design by really focusing on training and focusing on knowledge transfer, it's really more of this traditional mindset. But if you're really thinking about how learning is needed every day, and you're looking for approaches that help you design that type of learning, we're really focusing on creating this seamless connection between learners and resources. We might not control every single learning asset. Someone else might control it. It might be crowdsourced. It might be repurposed. But we're facilitating that connection and making sure learners know you have this cluster of assets to support you to close this capability gap. And because it's not one and done, we have greater confidence that it's impacting back on the job, because it's not just at that first moment of need. We're also thinking about when they run into a problem, when they need to apply it, when they need to learn more, and what learning assets are available in those moments of need. So just a quick bird's eye view of the action, of the 5 actions. In the change action, this is where we're starting, as we all do in L&D. We start by setting our goal for the learning cluster. The difference is because our goal is not just for the end of program or one learning asset, we're really setting a goal for the whole learning cluster, which means we're setting a goal for the change we want to see back on the job. And so this automatically starts to create a big shift for L&D, because we really start to get our heads out of the sand with our class, our video, and our by the end of this, you'll be able to do this type of mentality. Instead, we focus on what's important for the business, what's the business pain they're trying to solve for, and what's important for the learner. What do you actually want them to do differently back on the job after this, if this learning cluster works? And so that new objective, it's not a terminal objective or enabling objective. It's a new objective. It's an objective for the whole learning cluster. And we call that the strategic performance objective. For the learn action, this is the learn learner to learner differences action. Instead of focusing on a single target audience, which we usually do, we really have a tool that helps develop learner personas. And we're not developing learner personas at random. We're very strategic about this. We link these back to that strategic performance objective. We're very interested in learner personas that will make the most impact on closing the business pain. And that's a part of the tool and the process. In the upgrade action, this is something we really haven't seen in other models. We're really great at designing new things, but we don't often have a strategic, rigorous, consistent way to look at assets we already have out there in the field and understand, how do we upgrade these? And a lot of times that is the challenge that folks are facing is, well, I've had this training program. I know the content's great, but it's just a little bit out of date, or we're not getting the kind of engagement we would like. I need a way to upgrade this. So rather than starting from scratch, the 9 elements of modern learning, which is a tool, it helps to reuse and repurpose those existing assets. Then the surround action, this is really the heart of the model. So it's the surround with meaningful assets action. And this is where we take all the learnings from the change, learn, and upgrade actions, and we strategically choose what learning assets will make up that social, formal, immediate. And what's so great about this is now we're not forced to cram all of our insights into one program. A lot of times the feedback we get from learners is, man, that class didn't feel like me, or I just didn't know what to do with this afterwards back on the job. And it's because we've put so much into the one program and it wasn't at the moment of need. So by surrounding people with multiple assets, we're really focusing on chunking and thinking about those different moments of need and also personas, and giving each of those contexts what they need in the moment that they need it. And then the track action, of course, this is about measures. And in this case, because we are designing multiple learning assets in conjunction with one another in consideration, we're telling the story of a combined impact. You can still tell the story of a single asset in a cluster, but of course we're looking at the transformation back on the job as well. And so overall, you might start to get a sense that by combining these 5 actions together, you're really able to go outside of that cage of courses and classes and single asset, one and done type of thinking, and really deliver multiple assets that the learners choose whether they're going to use them or not. They might not use every single asset in your learning cluster. And that's, again, by design. Some of your learning assets will be tailored to certain learner personas. But 80 for the 20, those learner personas you investigated should have what they need across their moments of learning need, not just when learning the first time. And each of those actions has its own very detailed tool that helps walk you through this. You can learn a lot more about the actions and the tools. We have a book called Designing for Modern Learning, published last year, that does a really excellent job through storytelling, through case studies, to walk you through this. All of the tools are available as well online. And then we also have a workshop where you actually take something that you're working on and turn it into a learning cluster. And that's been huge. People end up actually implementing those. So I'm going to show you all 3 examples. And I'm going to start with, this is one from our class, from our workshop. And actually our workshop, it really role models the LCD model principle. So it's a very great combination of asynchronous, synchronous, social learning, immediate learning across 2 weeks of time, it's been an excellent experience for folks. So this is someone from our workshop who had the capability gap of everyday business storytelling, how to build a story in PowerPoint. She was designing this for sales and marketing professionals. And I'll just give you a quick overview because I want to show you two more examples and open up for questions. So she's all about improving storytelling capabilities. And what you see here is the business pain. And she used this statement to talk directly to stakeholders about why her learning cluster was important. And this is the kind of statement that got her stakeholders' attention and clear nodding heads of, yeah, of course we want to increase internal team productivity by limiting presentation rework. We see that all the time. Of course we want to improve client ratings, right? And then these are her on-the-job behaviors she was focusing on. So for the learners, this is what she wanted them to do every day. She wanted them to leverage the story framework. She wanted them to be able to adjust the narrative they were saying by the situation in front of them in the room. She wanted to be able to keep those stories focused based on the audience, fewer rounds of edits, increased visual aids, and so on. And so you can see that business pain piece in the strategic performance objective, as well as the changes the learners would do every single day on the job if this learning cluster worked. And so you can see that's a bit different than our typical terminal or enabling learning objectives that we might develop. Target learners. So she did some work on her learner personas, and these were the personas she came up with. So again, she's looking at sales and marketing professionals, and these are, kind of the typical, if she was thinking back to that business pain, who's going to make the most difference to that SPO, these are the folks she had on her radar. And this is actually something you can develop over learner interviews, surveys, looking at past data. There's a lot we teach related to that. And then when you take a look at her learning cluster, so she still had a few formal assets, of course, and you can see how those tie directly to her personas, who she was thinking of in mind. You had the immediate, so after the class or after the e-learning, they would have articles, they have a book they can refer to, they have job aids. And then socially, she had a really great model of having folks collaborate with their peers. So having actually pre and post presentation reviews as a formal part, formal is not the right word, more of as a expected norm and possibility for folks when they're working on telling a story through their presentations. So you can see that, some of these, it's up to the learner if they're going to use it or not, and it's going to be in their situation, their moment of need. So we'll take a look at another one. This is someone in our workshop who is working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They worked in the education space, especially with schools. So working with principals, teachers, directors, and she had specifically program directors who worked with the principals and teachers and so on. So in their case, they have the program directors who are facilitating equity content for these principals, teachers, so on of schools. And so when she was looking at the on-the-job behaviors, we really worked on narrowing these down to what she wanted to focus on as the initial part of the DEI journey. One of the things with DEI is it's extremely complex. You're not going to be able to teach it overnight. So it was really important that we focus on 5, no more than 5 on-the-job behaviors she wanted to close in terms of capability gap first. And she knew later on she's going to come back and revise this learning cluster as her organization grows in capability. So here, look at how specific these are. So on the job, we'll see directors, they'll become aware when tension exists in sessions. They'll be able to name the tension and use appropriate strategies to hold the space. Okay, so this is very clear. This isn't about what L&D wants directors to know or what a subject matter expert wants a director to know. This is about what she wanted directors to do with that information. And I guarantee you this was all a part of the communication to participants of, hey, this is what you're supposed to do with this. We want directors to be able to recognize when a participant has a biased belief and be able to make decisions on how to engage in conversation. And then even from the attitudinal perspective, so for those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, inspiring participants to continually reflect on their biases. So this is much more about the strategic performance objective. Again, this is about the whole learning cluster and what you want folks to do to close the business pain. In this case, again, because DEI is so complex, we really had her narrowed down to just a single persona. And she thought about, originally she had a lot of personas, and she really narrowed down to Doubtful Dan, because that was the skeptic in her organization. Skeptic in the sense that they were skeptical of their own abilities, but they were already passionate about DEI. So they saw the need, but they weren't confident in their own capabilities. And she was like, if I can help Doubtful Dan first, that's going to help our organization a ton in shifting our DEI goals. So she really first focused on this persona. And she really tailored things. So she had a existing deck, and she thought about all of the things she's seen the Doubtful Dans in the organization not have confidence in, and really focus and break down the curricula differently. You can see that there's a lot of social and immediate, and that's really great to see, because when it comes to DEI, sure, you can learn it in the classroom, but where rubber really hits the road is in that immediate and social piece. You need a lot of practice that's in safe spaces, and you need things in the moment when you run into a challenge, and you can't just wait for the class. And so that's what you're seeing here in her learning cluster. And then the very last one I'll share, this one I wanted to share because, and by the way, both of the ones I've just shared, again, those are developed in the workshop. So they were really developed in about a week of time. And both of those are ones they felt confident implementing when they went back on the job. And one of the great things about the workshop is it's actually you're still at work while you're doing it. So they were able to leverage their learners. They're able to call up directors and ask them their thoughts and so on during the workshop. So it's very in the flow of work itself. This one is actually one we did. I have a team of consultants that we develop learning clusters for organizations. And this is one where I really point this out because a lot of folks might look at this and feel overwhelmed, like, oh, I now have to create all these different assets and it's going to take a lot longer. Well, that's really not the case. We've done projects that take us about 4 weeks, and you've got these different assets, and this was one of those examples. So this was for a compliance training. This is a pharmaceutical organization, and they were really focused on quality issues. And in the past, they really just had an SOP that they had translated into a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint was essentially just a direct representation of the SOP. So you can imagine how well that worked in terms of impact on the job. So we really sat down with them and figured out, okay, what's your goal? The main challenge they were seeing was adherence to timelines in the quality issue process. And then we really just dug into the different roles, because of course they were really just focused on their end user, the QI owners, their global project leads. They weren't really considering training for any of these other folks and how these folks actually support the QI owners and the global project leads in learning and actually meeting those timelines. So we actually, thought through those different learner personas and ended up recommending a learning cluster where we upgraded their training, really focused on more of a story-based e-learning, because there were a lot of different roles involved in this process. And the training was, you all are probably familiar with this, a very one-size-fits-all type of training. And so we wanted to do two things. We wanted to chunk provide bite-sized segments of that same training, but by role. So if you're a QI owner, this is the only portion of the timeline you're a part of, versus if you're a XYZ manager, this is the part of the timeline you're most involved in, and here's your learning experience. And then we wanted the story-based e-learning to showcase the full timeline story of all of the characters and participants. Of course, we have the SOP itself as an immediate tool, but there's a lot of places where this SOP was not available. It was not available in the moment of need. So the actual place where people submit quality issues, there's no link to the SOP. So there's sometimes some very small things you can do to just make things more accessible. Recognition can be a point of learning for folks if you think about how leaders reinforce learning and so on. So just to start wrapping this up so we can get to some questions, you'll see in our journal article, we've done some research on the impact of the model. It's been really interesting to see who's finding the model useful, because at first we thought it would really just be these folks, the L&D professionals, people who are instructional designers, facilitators, training managers, and leaders. And for sure, we see these folks involved and really loving the model. We've also seen huge response from executive leaders of companies. So CEOs, COOs, CMOs who are responsible for change efforts. And they're thinking about, how do we change culture? We've often had C-suite leaders actually tell their L&D department, hey, have you heard of this Designing for Modern Learning book? Like, I think you need to really take a look at it. So that's been really fascinating and rewarding. And for us, it really speaks to how this model has really resonated with the business. And that was one of our original goals, was how do we develop a model that's going to feel more impactful and more confidence back in terms of impact back on the job. And we're really seeing that with the language we use. Learning assets is something executive leaders instantly understand. Learner personas, they get it. It's great. Companies that sell training as a product, oftentimes there's companies that are selling off-the-shelf courses, and they're realizing, wow, man, maybe this could be a change in my business strategy if I'm actually offering more of a learning cluster outside of that one and done off-the-shelf course. Educators, so of course we've seen college professors, high school teachers, especially those who are adapting to remote learning, take an interest. And then also very interesting from an industry perspective, sales and marketing professionals specifically have been very interested. And it's again, this is funny for us because we actually borrowed marketing principles such as personas. Customer personas is a big thing in the marketing space. We actually modified that for the learning industry. And sales and marketing folks are looking at that and saying, wow, we really should be thinking about selling as learning for our customers. And so we've actually had a number of people who are working in the event space, sales and marketing, professional associations, trade associations, who are actually finding this model really useful. There's a lot people are saying about the model. We have in that research paper, we found in our survey, we have a 77% NPS score. So people are really promoting the model. We love how it sparked new creativity and excitement for people. We've had a lot of people tell us, this is the way they're going to be doing learning design in the future. So, and then this last comment, I'll just point out, it helps me sell training because it fits into the flow of work and life rather than a person having to take 60 or 90 minutes at a time to learn something. That pretty much sums it up. A lot of people see the value of a model that helps them strategically think through all those learning assets that could possibly be there in and out of the flow of work, but all of them don't really need to be there, right? There's a wealth of technologies, wealth of avenues nowadays we can deliver learning. It doesn't mean all of them make sense. And it doesn't mean everything needs to be technology based, because a lot of the times people are learning is social learning. So really thinking about that whole spectrum. So ultimately, my takeaway message for you all is just that disruption has rocked every industry, and then of course it's rocked L&D. And in the last 20 years, I've watched folks experience this change in small pieces, but that full picture with the pandemic, especially, we see that it's transformed. And we really need to think about not just bringing in new technologies and just trying to install them and hope for the best, or just moving everything to e-learning or videos. We really need a way to help us design learning differently than we have in the past, and also all with this new goal in mind of surrounding diverse learners, not just one target audience, with multiple assets, and really setting our sights on the job change, not just at the end of this workshop, at the end of this training, at the end of this video type of change. So yep, that pretty much sums it up of traditional L&D models and what we're doing here with the LCD model. And just, sorry, last note, and I'll open for questions. This all still leverages our roots. So one of the, again, great things about the model is we're not trying to throw out all of our really amazing L&D expertise. All of these other models really feed into the different actions and can help you along the way make the most of designing these multiple assets. So just a couple of ways to learn more and to stay in touch with us. We do free monthly dialogues, and these are really just about modern learning. We have different speakers who talk about modern learning from different angles. And we also have examples of learning clusters, like folks who are working on that share occasionally as well. I told you all about the workshop. You can get, we're working on a certification for the LCD model right now. The workshop will be a part of that. So if you want to get started, you can. And then if you're, one of the first places we see people starting is the upgrade action, because it's a quick and easy win. And you can go to lcdworkshop.com. I really recommend you all to go to lcdworkshop.com anyway. We really don't bother you too much, and it's a really good way to just start to stay connected with a lot of different modern L&D leaders who are thinking along these lines of what's really changing with the digital age, and how are we really being strategic about it and not just reactive or ad hoc. What's our actual planned approach towards this? So really recommend staying in touch there. We're really trying to convene folks who are interested in modern learning. And if you're one of those folks, I would love to connect with you as well. So I'll stop there and just see what we have going on in chat and Q&A. And hopefully you all did hear me. I assume, Steve, you would have interrupted me. It seems like there was a person who couldn't hear, but I hope you all were able to hear that, because that was the whole presentation.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And hopefully, yeah, that was an issue on that person's end. It didn't seem like it was an issue with everybody in the group, so that was good. And hopefully that person got back in. So thank you, Crystal. That was a really interesting presentation. We do have a question here. If anybody has questions, please type them in the question and answer queue. And so if you'd like, Crystal, I can read it and you can respond. Carla asks, or says, I am totally sold on the strategic performance objective, and I have used it in a recent asset I designed, but I still use TLOs and ELOs as supporting objectives. Should I step away from the TLOs and ELOs entirely, or are the use of all three of them still okay?
That is a really excellent question. And I'll just share, let me go back to this real quick. So yes, 100% you still need your terminal learning objectives and your enabling learning objectives. So once you've selected what those learning assets are going to be that make up your learning cluster, you still got to go through and actually design each of those assets. So even if I pull up, say, one of those examples we were looking at, and we take a look at, this is Jen's example, this e-learning she's talking about, or the articles, or the book, or the job aids, she's still going to want to go back and say, what's the terminal objective of my job aid? And what she might find, what's my terminal enabling objectives of my job aid, to help her design that that piece. And she might find that some of those terminal enabling objectives might be reused from her e-learning. So we actually, in our surround tool, we actually talk about how you can first generate that list of terminal enabling objectives you're going after, and then almost do kind of like a matching exercise between these different learning assets. So you certainly don't want to lose that detailed design work that we do, where we're thinking through at the end of this learning asset, what am I going to need? It's just we wanted to also introduce that higher order goal of what's my goal for when I'm designing all of those assets together. And that's often what we've seen as organizations are, they have videos in one place, they have this in one place, they haven't really thought about how do all of those things work together and what's the point of them working together. And that's really how the SPO, it just gets you really thinking about that. So great question.
Great. Thank you, Carla. Any other questions? Again, if you have questions, you can type them in. I was thinking, I had a question for you, Crystal. I'm wondering what the role of content is in making choices about learning assets, because you talk a lot about the people you're teaching, but I would think that the content might also affect your choice of assets. And I'm thinking about like whether you're teaching something that's like a procedure, like how to do something, versus whether you're teaching something like that's more attitudinal or things like that. So talk about content a little bit and how that relates here.
Yeah,
Please.
that's a great question, Steve. So 100%, if you're, and actually let's just use the example you're talking about. So something that's more like that SOP type of training, we might, and that's procedural, we might really find that a lot of our learning assets are really heavy on the immediate, it's called a learning touch point actually. So that immediate piece, because a lot of times we'll teach people an entire procedure in a class, they walk out, they're not using it for 6 months, 9 months, and they forget it all. And what they really need is that job aid, and they need that awareness of, oh, I'm in this situation. Where is this piece? Let me go there, find it. And that's where oftentimes we really need to work better with IT or our internet management folks to make sure that things are searchable. And we have that can actually be a big part of our learning asset, is how searchable is this? So the other example, if you're doing more of a complex soft skills capability, another program I worked on was more of like a innovation capability gap. They wanted to teach high potentials and leaders to be more innovative and that type of thing. We're really looking at the social piece and the formal piece much more heavily than the immediate, because a lot of, even when we started analyzing how do innovations happen in this organization as a part of the work, well, they happen because you're interacting with someone who works in a completely different part of the organization than you, and that sparks, something new. So the social learning aspect was really huge in that, and some of that was really important to have in an immersive formal space where people are, in that kind of like a hackathon type of mentality. So the content definitely, the capability gap rather that you're going for definitely should be dictating what kind of ratio of formal, immediate, social you're going for. And a lot of folks, again, in our typical L&D toolkit, we stick to the class and we don't even ask that question of, is this the best way to deliver the content for the capability gap we've got going on?
Yeah, great, thank you.
And Carla, I see your comment in chat and absolutely would love to hear your experience. And, if you're working on learning clusters actively, again, we would love to see you at one of our modern learning dialogues. We often have folks share the work they're doing in progress, and it's great. It's really great learning for everyone.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Crystal? Okay, well, seeing none, I guess this is the conclusion of our session. And again, thank you very much, Crystal. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot from you, and I appreciate being able to sit in and listen and learn. So thank you very much. And thanks to everybody. I believe we have a half an hour break, and then we will start again at the bottom of the hour with our next sessions.
Have a wonderful conference, everyone, and thank you so much for having me.